They say you can measure a generation by the sound that raised it. And in 1959, that sound was rock and roll, young, loud, and full of promise. But on one frozen night in Iowa, that sound fell silent. A small plane lifted off into the dark, carrying 3 of the brightest voices America ever heard. By sunrise, the radio was quiet, and a new phrase was born: the day the music died. But this isn't just about a crash. It's about what it means when a dream outgrows the road it's traveling on. It's about Buddy, Ritchie, and the Big Bopper, and the moment the future changed direction mid-air. Now, let me take you back a few weeks before that Iowa night. The winter dance party wasn't a tour so much as a forced march with guitars. The itinerary read like a dare. Midwest towns strung together with brutal drives, sometimes 400 miles overnight, because a promoter thought maps were flat and time never slept. From January 23rd to mid-February, it was supposed to be a rolling celebration. It felt like a test of endurance. The bus was the villain. You know that kind of cold that finds the crack in your jacket and builds a house there? That was the bus. The heater gave up early, like it heard the schedule and said, "I'm out." I remember kids coming off those stages with fingers so stiff they could barely unbutton their shirts. They borrowed socks. They shared coats. The smell inside was wool, sweat, and the sharp sting of winter breathing down your neck. But every night, when the lights went up, a different universe appeared. Buddy Holly would step out, glasses fogging just a touch, strum the first chord of "That'll Be the Day," and the room would tilt. He had this way of turning teenage knots into clean melody, like he was ironing out your heart while you danced. He wrote constantly on the road, in diners, anywhere the coffee stayed warm. It felt like the songs were chasing him, not the other way round. Ritchie Valens was a comet, 17, and somehow older than the room. He'd hit the riff to La Bamba, and kids who'd never heard a word of Spanish suddenly knew every beat of it in their bones. His voice carried 2 worlds, San Fernando grit and national radio shine. Off stage, he grinned shy, like he couldn't quite believe the noise he was making. Then he'd get a phone call from home, and you'd see the boy in him, the tenderness. It made the roar mean more. The Big Bopper, J.P. Richardson, he brought the radio with him. Comedy, patter, that booming "Hello, baby," that could turn a microphone into a dance partner. He wasn't just singing, he was hosting the party, stitching it together with jokes while fighting off a stubborn cough that wouldn't let go. He'd make a room laugh and then win it with Chantilly lace, and you'd swear the stage got bigger to fit him. Nights had a rhythm. Hit the stage hard, count the cash quick, then climb back onto that freezing bus and watch the highway become a metronome. Sleep came in slices. Showers were a rumor, laundry piled up like a snowdrift, and the stakes were simple: miss one show, add momentum shivers to a stop. Make every show, and you stay hot enough to matter. Managers talked about radio spins and chart positions. The musicians talked about food, heat, and a mattress that didn't bounce when a tire hit ice. Here's the thing about youth on a schedule: your body keeps score. Fingers cracked, ears rang. A flu rolled through the caravan, and still the kids lined up outside gymnasiums and ballrooms, coats pulled to their chins, cheeks flushed with the same fever the bands were trying to sweat out. That kind of devotion keeps you going. It also makes you gamble. A little risk for a lot of relief? You start nodding before the sentence ends. Which brings us to the math that mattered. A plane wasn't luxury. It was survival. A chance to skip the bus for a few hours, to reach the next town early, to find a laundromat and a warm bed. Clean clothes before the next show. a shower that didn't need to be imagined. They weren't chasing glamour. They were chasing body heat and rest. I still remember a backstage in Wisconsin, somewhere with cinder block walls and a coffee pot that tasted like it had been brewing since Eisenhower. Buddy hunched over a notebook, tapping his foot, while Ritchie practiced that La Bamba run on a beat-up acoustic. The Bopper told a joke he'd told the night before, and it was still funny, because radio timing never gets old. Outside, a kid handed over a folded note for Donna, asking, "Please, please play it for his girl." They did, and for 3 minutes, the cold outside didn't exist. But the road kept asking, and the road always collects. Toward the end of January, with the heater giving up again and the hours getting mean, the idea strengthened. Get off the bus, even for one leg. Buy back a little humanity. If you think about it, the entire tragedy begins here, not with fame or folly, but with a basic need: warmth, rest, a clean shirt. The tour made that simple choice feel like a smart plan, even a necessary one. And yet, while the applause rang and the coins clinked in cash boxes, something else was wearing thin: the margin for error. Routes grew longer, weather grew worse, bodies grew tired. The music soared every night, but offstage the air itself felt heavier. That's how it was back then. Rock and roll promised freedom on stage, the road charged interest offstage, and the bill was coming due. While that was happening across the Midwest, Clear Lake sat like a promise on the calendar. The surf ballroom, warm lights, wood floors that knew every shoe size in northern Iowa, and a neon glow that whispered, "Come in, thaw out, forget the wind for a while." The tour added it late, a patch to a brutal stretch, and the kids in town were hungry for it. They'd heard the heater stories. They'd seen the headlines. But what they wanted was simple: to dance. You have to understand the surf. It felt like summer, even in February. Palms painted on the walls, a stage that made people look taller, the kind of place where the first bass note vibrated the rib cage, and your hands found a rhythm before your head caught up. The band rolled in with the road still on their faces, red cheeks, cracked lips, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. And then the door opened, and the warmth reached them like an embrace. Backstage, it was the usual chaos trimmed with kindness. Set lists scribbled on torn paper, handshake promises with local boys who brought amps through the back alley, a borrowed coat passed to someone who couldn't stop shivering. A kid pressed up against the doorway, clutched a record sleeve, and tried not to shake when Buddy signed it. Another asked Ritchie if La Bamba would make the set. He smiled that shy smile and said, "Count on it." Meanwhile, the bus sat outside like a bad memory. The heater had failed again. You could see the breath of every man who stepped through its door. Jackets stayed on, gloves didn't come off. And under all that steam and chatter, the decision began to harden. Play the show, finish strong, then skip the frostbit miles. Find a plane. Buddy started doing the math out loud. Charter a Beechcraft out of Mason City, $36 a seat. Not cheap, not crazy. If they flew north, they could grab a few hours of sleep, do laundry, maybe even sit down to a real breakfast before Moorhead. Laundry became a talisman word that night. Clean socks, a pressed shirt, a chance to feel human for a second. Here's where the human shuffle comes in. Waylon Jennings, running bass for Buddy, gave his spot to the Big Bopper, who was fighting that nagging cough and looked like the bus might finish what the flu started. Simple kindness, heavy cost. Tommy Alsop and Ritchie Valens settled it the old way. A coin flip. Heads, a seat. Tails, the bus. Ritchie called it, won it, and tried to hide the relief sitting behind his grin. On stage, none of that showed. The surf ballroom bloomed. Peggy Sue bounced like rubber on hot asphalt. Donna turned the whole room into a letter folded twice and pressed in a pocket. And La Bamba shook the rafters until the painted palms almost swayed for real. The Big Bopper leaned into the mic. "Hello, baby." And you felt the room laugh with its whole chest. For 90 minutes, Winter lost, but offstage, logistics took the wheel. Someone checked the time. Someone else called Dwyer, flying service. Weather reports sounded workable, not welcoming. The phrase, "quick hop," did the heavy lifting. Back in the alley, snow hissed against the brick, and the wind said, "Don't," the way wind always does when it's got nothing better to say. The encores hit, coats went back on, and the night turned toward the runway. Nobody thought they were tempting fate. They thought they were buying a little rest, a little mercy. Music faded and miles took over. That's how the road works. It smiles at you under the lights, then asks for payment in the dark. While the last notes from the surf were still floating in people's coats, the road crew hustled gear and men toward Mason City Municipal. After 1 a.m., the prairie looked like a blank page. 4 inches of crusted snow flattened the fields, fences turned into lines on graph paper, and the wind erased footprints as fast as you could make them. The airport lights threw small halos on a night that didn't want to be seen. Dwyer Flying Service sat low and practical, the way Midwestern buildings do when winters teach humility. Inside, phones rang in clipped sentences, pencils scratched weather notes, and a coffee pot worked overtime for anyone stepping in from the knife-edge cold. The Beechcraft Bonanza, tail number N3I794N, waited outside like a promise with propeller blades. Small, quick, a single-engine workhorse. It looked eager. It also looked like it belonged to another season. Roger Peterson was 21 and steady-handed, the kind of kid who'd grown up with chores before sunrise and knew how to keep moving when the world said stop. He'd flown these fields, knew their flat honesty, and believed in the instruments bolted into his cockpit. But the sky that night wasn't honest. Patchy visibility, blowing snow, a low cloud deck that kept secrets. He wasn't rated for the deeper instrument conditions the weather was whispering about. He'd flown nights. He'd flown winter. He hadn't flown this exact cocktail often, and never with 3 names the whole country knew strapped behind him. Meanwhile, the clock did what clocks always do on tour. It dared you. Buddy handled the arithmetic. Mason City to Fargo Moorhead, a short hop on paper, an eternity by bus, a couple hours of sleep on arrival, laundry before sound check. The phrase, "we'll be there ahead of the bus," kept them warm as they signed receipts. $36 a seat felt like paying for a window you could open in a sealed room. Out on the tarmac, the wind bit through wool and bravado. Luggage got stuffed quick. Guitar cases, small bags, the kind of cargo you choose when you think you'll be seeing your suitcase by breakfast. Waylon Jennings hung back, the Big Bopper's cough still echoing in his ears. He'd traded his seat earlier and tried not to think about luck as a currency. Tommy Alsop shook Ritchie's hand at the edge of the light. The coin flip had been hours ago, but it still felt warm in the palm of his memory. The pre-flight looked normal from the outside. Walk around, fuel check, lights tested, voices reading through lists. In the cold, metal talks to your fingers in a language you don't forget. Tight bolts, brittle edges, the smell of avgas mixing with snow. In the office, a weather briefing leaned cautious. Winds, ceilings, visibility. The words marginal and improving shared the page, which is how pilots end up negotiating with hopes they didn't know they had. One more thing. Those Midwestern horizons vanish at night. No stars, no lights, just a dome of black that erases the line your body depends on. Buddy climbed in with the focus he brought to microphones and melody. He wanted that laundry, that bed, the reset 1,000 miles of applause couldn't buy. The Bopper settled his frame, grateful and wheezing less just for being off that cursed bus. Ritchie tucked in, wide-eyed, trying to memorize everything, like a kid who'd gotten the good seat and didn't want to waste it. Roger tightened straps, checked gyros, glanced at the artificial horizon like a friend he trusted more than his own ears. Back at the fence, a couple of locals watched noses redden and breath braid away. One of them muttered something about the wind. The other stared at the prop and said nothing. Airports at night have their own religion, hushed, practical, optimistic. Everyone believes the runway is a straight sentence the sky will read correctly. Permission to taxi. The Bonanza rolled, wheels bumping over seams of frozen ground, a small tremor running up the fuselage like a shiver. At the end of the runway, Roger ran the engine up and listened for harmony. Magnetos, prop, mixture. He set the heading indicator, glanced at the compass, and noted the breeze trying to push a shoulder into the plane. Instruments glowed dim green. Altimeter, airspeed, that little blue and brown horizon that lies to you only when your own senses do first. Throttle forward. The tail lifted. Snow streaked sideways. The runway lights slid past like beads on a string, and then the world did what it does in black Iowa wind. It took the horizon away. No reference point, just instruments and faith. The doze pitched up into a climb, and for a moment the math held. Airspeed alive, positive rate, gear fixed and irrelevant. A slight left turn to course. The kind of move you can make 1,000 times when your stomach and your eyes agree on what level means. But the body in a small plane at night wants to trust the inner ear more than the dial that says up, down, bank, or straight, and sometimes the inner ear gets it wrong. Spatial disorientation isn't dramatic from the ground. It's a quiet thief. A slow, confident voice telling you your wings level while the instrument says you're not. It can start as a whisper. It can end in seconds. Nobody in that cabin wanted risk. They wanted rest. The airplane lifted into the murk. The snow turned from flakes into a blizzard of tiny lies, and Roger chased the truth on his panel while his senses argued. From the airport office, the red and green nav lights shrank into the field of night, then blended with stars that weren't there. Meanwhile, on the road north of town, the bus grumbled through drifts, heatless and full of sleeping men who didn't know the sky was sorting out a decision their lives depended on. Back at the surf, a janitor swept confetti and ticket stubs into a pile, humming a tune he couldn't get out of his head. In the farmhouse nearest the airport, a porch light burned like a vow against the dark. This was the moment everything changed, and nobody in that town felt it yet. The Bonanza climbed, banked, and disappeared into a horizon that had stepped back out of reach. 3 miles north-northwest of Clear Lake, the land rolls so gently you'd swear it's level. In winter, it turns into a white sheet tucked tight over rows of stubbled corn, fence posts like the teeth of a broken comb. Farmers can read that ground in the dark by smell alone. Cut stalk, frozen loam, diesel ghosts. That night, the field read nothing back. It just waited. Up in the black, the instruments kept talking, airspeed, rate of climb, that stubborn artificial horizon. Roger worked his scan, eyes bouncing, hands steady, making the corrections every pilot makes without thinking when day and gravity agree. But the ear is a persuasive liar. In a slow, unrecognized bank, your inner compass says you're straight, tells you to fix what isn't broken. Correct the correction, and the turn tightens. Lower the nose to hold speed, and the ground starts writing its own ending. He made a left turn to intercept the planned course. The left wanted more. The nose trimmed up to keep climb, and then the speed sighed. The altimeter crept, then stalled, then slid. A small slip becomes a spiral when your senses double down on the wrong story. In that cockpit, seconds stretched, a nudge on the yoke, a tap of rudder, the blue and brown disk whispering one thing while bones swore another. This is how quiet accidents happen, not with panic, but with confidence misled by night. From the farmhouse off Gull Avenue, a dog barked at nothing, then everything. The wind carried no engine note, too far, too muffled, swallowed by snow and distance. A porch light flickered in a draft. In town, the janitor locked the surf's back door and pulled his collar up against a gust that felt personal. A descending turn tightens its own noose. The Bonanza's wing met the wind at the wrong angle, and the nose took the path of least resistance, down and through. The right wing clipped the earth first, plowing a clean, brutal arc through frost and stalk. Metal folded like wet cardboard at 65 inches of mercury. The fuselage flipped, tore, stopped. Silence returned with a kind of authority only winter knows. There's a kind of sound you don't hear so much as feel in your teeth. The first farmer on that stretch woke without knowing why, listened, heard only wind, and went back to a thin sleep he'd remember forever. Nothing flamed high, no sky lit up, just a hard final punctuation mark pressed into a field that had carried harvest after harvest without complaint. Morning came gray and late. The search started with a call to the tower, a question shaped like a hope that maybe they'd diverted, maybe they'd landed up the line. Phones passed the worry like a baton, airport to service desk to sheriff to pilots who knew the back roads and the way snow drifts hide everything that matters. Around 9:35 a.m., the wreckage came into view. The tail twisted, the fuselage broken open, the torn skin of the Bonanza shining dull against the frost. Men in heavy coats moved slow, careful with the world and quicker with their breath. They spoke less than they thought. 4 bodies, thrown clear. Buddy, Ritchie, the Big Bopper, Roger. No survivors. Tags came out, hands shook, pencils tried to stay steady as they recorded what the eyes couldn't soften. Someone covered a face with a blanket out of reflex, then remembered the cold had already done that part. The official words would come later. Loss of control, spatial disorientation, weather unfit for a pilot not fully instrument qualified in those conditions. On paper, it looks clean. In a cockpit, it's a storm of tiny decisions, a rush of trust placed in dials you check 100 times, until the one time you doubt the only truth that can save you. Darkness and snow sealed it. That's the phrase. It leaves out the human ache. Back in Mason City, the phone started finding kitchens. A promoter's voice cracked over breakfast. A manager spoke like he was reading a script he hadn't agreed to. In Lubbock, a mother's hands went still in dishwater that had gone cold while the radio kept talking. In Pacoima, a neighborhood that had just learned to spell Valens now learned the word memorial. In Beaumont, the laugh that had filled jukeboxes felt like a ghost at noon. Waylon carried a weight he didn't ask for. He'd traded that seat out of kindness and would replay the choice for years, hearing his own voice telling Buddy, as a joke that felt like a curse, "I hope your old plane crashes," and then living with a line no one deserves. Tommy Alsop heard a coin hitting an invisible table every night for the rest of his life. People say fate flips the coin for you. It doesn't. You flip it yourself. Fate just chooses when heads means goodbye. Meanwhile, radio stations broke format. DJs cleared their throats and failed. Songs that had felt like summer now sounded like letters from a friend you'd never see again. Teenagers lay on their beds, staring at ceilings, hearing the air in the room hum with a new kind of quiet. The country didn't know how to grieve rock and roll yet. It learned that morning. At the edge of that field, the snow drifted and drifted again, covering what it could, leaving what it couldn't. A sheriff's deputy stood a long minute with his hat in his hand. The wind talked around him. Out on 315th Street, a pickup idled too long. Somebody said, "God," but not to start a conversation. And the plane that had promised a little warmth delivered a truth the road had been hinting at for weeks. The margin was gone. While the snow settled back into its quiet work, the first ripples hit the radios. Morning shows that usually teased school closings and played bright little numbers stumbled over their own tongues. A DJ in Des Moines tried to say the names and couldn't get past Buddy's. He cued a record, missed the groove, and let the needle skate. Another in Chicago said the word plane like it had suddenly grown heavier. Across the dial, chatter thinned, music filled the gaps, and even the happy songs sounded like they were standing at attention. Kitchen tables went still. Mothers reached for volume knobs and then for chairs. Coffee cooled untouched. Fathers who'd rolled their eyes at the noise found themselves staring at the toaster, hearing that noise as a heartbeat. I knew kids who'd saved allowance for those singles, Peggy Sue, Donna, Chantilly Lace, and kept them stacked by the record player like a pile of friends. That morning, they laid the sleeves out on the rug like photographs and traced the lettering with a finger. Teenagers did what teenagers do when the world tilts, retreated to bedrooms, doors shut softly, not slammed. Someone in Ohio pulled the curtains and played "That'll Be the Day" 5 times, like maybe the 5th would rewrite the news. A girl in Minnesota took the bus to school with her head against the window, counting fence posts until she ran out of numbers. In Texas, a boy who'd practiced Buddy's hiccup on a pawn shop guitar touched the pick to the strings and set it down again. Silence felt louder than a crowd. Bands on the road heard it in snatches, gas station radios half-tuned, a clerk in a wool cap saying, "You hear about?" as change clinked into a metal drawer. The jokes backstage got small and then disappeared. Somebody wrapped a scarf twice around his neck without noticing. Somebody else stared at a poster and realized the date printed there had just become a memorial. The winter got meaner. Every icy mile looked like a threat you suddenly believed. Industry people, promoters, managers took out calendars and for the first time saw cruelty in their own handwriting. Cities stacked too close, drives drawn with rulers instead of common sense. The phone calls were brittle. "We'll reschedule" sounded like a lie told with good intentions. A few started talking about buses with heaters that worked, about hotel nights that weren't optional, about maybe not booking 6 shows in 6 towns across 3 states in 1 week. It took a crash to make the ledger look like lives. Meanwhile, in Clear Lake, the surf ballroom breathed different air. The posters still clung to the walls, but they'd gained weight overnight. Someone set a bouquet by the stage. Someone else left a 45 on the apron, label up like an offering. The light crew came in and didn't turn everything on. It felt wrong to flood the room. People walked softer. The stage, warm from bodies a few hours before, cooled into an altar. Waylon Jennings went quiet. He didn't tell the story then. He carried it. That offhand line he'd thrown to Buddy in a musician's teasing rhythm, "I hope your old plane crashes," lodged like a splinter under the skin of his days. He played on, but the sentence followed him, a shadow that didn't care about noon. Tommy Alsop kept hearing the coin. Heads, tails, heads, tails. He'd feel it leave his thumb in the middle of a new city and look at the floor like he might find it there. Parents tried to translate the grief into something they recognized. Some said, "It's just music." Their kids looked at them like they'd missed the point. Others sat on the bed and asked, "Which one was your favorite?" It opened a little window. Buddy's glasses, Ritchie's grin, the Bopper's laugh. Families glued together with small talk and casseroles found themselves learning the names of songs they'd tuned out in the car. A phrase would come to name the ache, words that hadn't been invented yet for this morning. But long before that lyric found its singer, the country settled on a simpler understanding. Something young had been asked to grow up by dawn. We didn't have a handbook for that. We had radios, we had bedrooms, we had the way a heart learns to hold a tune and a loss at the same time. And still, under the static and the snow, the hum remained. Not an ending, a bruise that kept time. Years later, a kid from New York sat down with his own ghosts and a notebook, and the ache finally found its sentence. Don McLean called it American Pie, and when he reached the line, "The day the music died," you could feel the country exhale. There it was, the shorthand for a wound everyone had been carrying without a label. One phrase did what 1,000 tributes couldn't. It turned scattered grief into a single, singable memory. Now, I'll tell you what made that line stick. It wasn't just the rhyme or the melody. It was the feeling that youth had tried to outrun winter and lost. We all knew that feeling by then. The 60s had come storming in with louder guitars and bigger crowds, but underneath the noise was that February morning, snow, radio static, and the first time rock and roll had to look at a calendar and admit it wasn't immortal. McLean didn't teach us the loss. He gave us a way to say it out loud. And yet, the song isn't a funeral march. It's a long drive with the windows cracked, memory blowing through like cold air that keeps you awake. He stacks images, cheerleaders, whiskey, levees dry, and somehow you're back in a gymnasium with paper streamers and a guitar that might change your life. Then the line drops, and your chest tightens. You're not just remembering a crash. You're remembering the morning after when everyone tried to keep moving like normal and couldn't. What nobody knew at the time of the crash was how much language matters when hearts don't know where to put their hands. That phrase made room. It let people who'd loved Buddy's glasses, Ritchie's grin, the Bopper's laugh, speak the same sentence without arguing about details. Meaning outran fact, the way songs do. The music didn't die. It aged overnight. It learned to carry weight without losing tempo. That's the truth you hear in that chorus, whether you know the backstory or not. Meanwhile, radio stations found themselves using the line as if it had always existed. Anniversaries rolled around, and the phrase did the heavy lifting. A DJ would read it, pause, then drop a needle on Rave On, and the moment felt whole, grief with a backbeat. Kids who hadn't been born in '59 learned the words before they learned the history. Teachers explained the crash. The lyric explained the feeling. This was the moment everything found its container. A private bruise became a public scar, and nobody had to apologize for remembering. Songs do that better than statues. They move with you. They show up in grocery aisles and back seats, and every time that chorus comes around, the line opens the door and the room fills again with voices that never stopped singing. If you drive out past Clear Lake, turn off at 315th and follow the gravel until the wind does most of the talking, you'll find the field. It doesn't announce itself. Private farmland rows when the season's right, drifts when it's not. But at the edge, stainless steel markers catch the sun. A guitar neck, A few records, names cut clean into metal that doesn't mind February. People leave guitar picks, ticket stubs, notes in plastic sleeves that crinkle like leaves when the breeze leans in. I've stood there with strangers who felt like kin, boots crunching, noses red. No one saying much at first. You look out over that gentle roll of ground and think about how quiet endings really are. No grand crescendo, just a line in the soil and the kind of silence that's heavier than noise. Somebody will whisper a lyric, maybe, "Well, that'll be the day," and the field takes it in without giving it back. That's all right. The point isn't to be heard, it's to remember aloud. Back in town, the surf ballroom keeps breathing. The place looks almost exactly like it did. Painted palms, rounded corners, a stage that turns regular folks into legends for an hour. They keep it warm, not as a museum that scolds you, but as a living room that invites you to dance. Anniversary nights draw crowds who weren't alive when the first show rolled in. They still dress up. They still bring their parents. A grandfather will put a hand on his granddaughter's shoulder during Donna, and you'll see two timelines share the same beat. According to the folks who run the surf, the ritual matters more than the displays. Walk the halls, read the posters, touch the rail, stand under the lights, and let your eyes adjust to the possibility that you're part of the story just by being there. You can almost hear the laugh before "Hello, baby," and the way a room inhales right before that La Bamba groove hits. Memory isn't a museum piece. It's a rehearsal that never quite ends. Out at the marker, the pilgrimage repeats itself. Someone kneels and leaves a pick. Someone else hums Peggy Sue under their breath because singing it full voice feels like taking too much. Couples take photos they'll barely look at because the picture that matters got taken somewhere behind the eyes. On windy days, you taste metal on your tongue and think of tail numbers and call signs. On still days, you hear a crow and mistake it for a prop wash you never actually heard. Why do we visit? To turn a headline back into people, to measure our own losses against theirs and admit we've been carrying more than we let on. The place doesn't solve anything. It doesn't try. It hands you a cold handle and asks you to hold it a while. Then it lets you go with a little more room in your chest. And here's where it loops back to the song. Monuments catch light. Music carries heat. The field gives you coordinates. The surf gives you a room. Together, they make a map you can follow whenever the world gets loud and you need to remember why the noise mattered in the first place. Walk the row, read the names, feel the wind, leave a pick, whisper a lyric, then step back into the day, knowing the beat didn't stop. It just moved into your own two hands. Let's talk about the ache that sits just past the facts, the futures that hovered over that runway and never touched down. Not because fantasy fixes anything, but because promise is part of the truth. Buddy first. I still hear the precision in his writing, the way he treated chords like clean architecture. Give him 5 more years and you don't just get more hits, you get a blueprint. He'd have built a studio in his head and then in real brick, wrangling sounds the way he'd already wrangled words, producing bands, mentoring kids with notebooks full of verses, showing them how to leave space in a song so the heart can breathe. You can feel the line from his beat to what Lennon and McCartney were about to do. I think Buddy would have been the quiet godfather walking through London in those glasses, reminding everyone that melody is the engine, not the paint. He was already pushing past the 2-minute single into something sturdier. Give him time, and he becomes a bridge between the first spark and the whole city that got built from it. Ritchie, 17 and already carrying 2 languages in one throat without apology. If you grew up straddling cultures, you heard yourself in him. He didn't ask permission to bring barrio rhythm into national radio. He just did it. Imagine him into the 60s and what that would have meant for kids who needed a face, a name, a sound that said, "You belong right here." Bilingual rock wouldn't have been a novelty. It would have been a lane on the highway. He had tenderness baked into those melodies. Donna is a slow dance and a love letter at once, and a dancer's sense of time. Give him the right band, the right producer, some space to experiment, and you get records that teach America to sway on different counts. The pipeline from garage bands in California neighborhoods to charts everywhere. He becomes the first wide-open valve. The Big Bopper, JP, saw the whole thing as show business, which is why he would have thrived as the stages got bigger and stranger. He had a broadcaster's instinct for audience and an editor's scissors for fat. Radio to TV, to variety specials, to early music videos, he would have cracked jokes between numbers and then landed a song like a hammer wrapped in velvet. And I'll tell you, he would have been a natural at championing other acts, playing ringmaster while bringing new kids into the spotlight. The business needed that, a big-hearted MC who understood how to keep the tent warm. Now, reality keeps its ledger. None of this changes that field, that morning, those names. But the what-ifs matter because they tell you what was already inside them. Trajectories don't lie, they just get interrupted. And maybe that's the hardest part, knowing the road they were on widened for others and hearing the shape of their footsteps in the pavement, which brings us back to us. Every encore is borrowed time. Every tour is a ledger of miles and luck and small mercies, a working heater, a clear sky, a decision that lands right. The promise isn't gone, it moved. It asks you to care for it like they did, with craft, with nerve, with a laugh into a microphone that turns a room into a home. Time moved on. Radio's tuned to new voices. But somewhere in that Iowa field, the snow still remembers the sound, not of the crash, but of laughter echoing in the surf ballroom, of songs unfinished and dreams that refused to stay buried. The world called it the day the music died. But maybe that's not quite true, because if you listen closely in the crackle of a vinyl record, in a highway at midnight, or in the trembling hands of a jukebox coin, you'll still hear them, the boys who never made it home, still singing beneath the static of time. Tap subscribe and bring someone who remembers or wants to. Same time next week, I'll put a record on. You bring the memories,